Welcome to the audio presentation of The Sting of Moral Clarity. I'm Dr. Chris Stout. I'll be narrating this, and I'm also the author of it. It originally appeared in LinkedIn. It's still there with a variety of links. I encourage you to look at the notes below because there's a lot of resources and tools that I'll be talking about that you can very easily hypertext click through. So I appreciate your time in listening to this, and please do reach out if we can be of help. I reread Peter Singer's book, The Life You Can Save, 10th Anniversary Edition, and doing background for a recent episode of my show, Living a Life in Full, and the interview I did with Charlie Bresler, Ph.D. It turns out that Charlie and I have a great deal in common, and perhaps on the top of that list is my deep respect for the perspective championed by the inspirational work of Peter Singer. A decade ago, Peter and Charlie co-founded The Life You Can Save, a non-profit dedicated to reducing extreme poverty with the euphonious homage to Peter's book and philosophy. The Life You Can Save's mission is to inspire more people to give effectively and to end world poverty. I would argue that it was perhaps the intellectual spark that ignited what is now called the effective altruism movement. While we all have been taught that we should be of help to those in need, I have to say this approach really makes you want to step up your game, as it were. His perspectives take the gloves off and full-throatedly admonishes us to do better by giving more, maybe even donating an organ. More on that in just a minute. It seems to the casual observer that regardless of one's spiritual tenets or philosophical perspectives, many forms of religion include pledging. Judaism has the traditional tithe, or a 10% of their income. The Roman Catholic natural law teachings goes about the standard of giving anything one has in superabundance to those unable to find enough to eat or meet similar basic needs. Muslims are required to give each year 1/40th of their wealth, with the rate varying according to the type of assets one has. Protestants are more likely to tithe, justifying the choice by the words of Jesus as reported by the Gospel writers Matthew and Luke. For example, Luke 12:48 notes that to whom much has been given, much will be required, which is generally considered to mean that we are held responsible for what we have. If we have been blessed with talents, wealth, knowledge, time, and the like, it's expected that we use such to the benefit of others, for example. From a more secular grounding, Peter notes that for millennia, wise people have said that doing good things brings fulfillment. Buddha advised his followers, set your heart on doing good. Do it over and over again, and you will be filled with joy. Socrates and Plato taught that the just man is happy. Epicurus wrote, it is impossible to live the pleasant life without also living sensibly, notably, and justly. And as for more business-forward approaches, there are Giving What We Can, an organization that draws on the familiar tithe and its pledge. The Founders Pledge, which allows founders of startups to choose what percentage, starting at 2%, they will donate when they sell their company. One for the World asks its student members to pledge an undemanding 1% of their post-graduation income. Pledge 1% similarly asks companies to donate 1% of their resources to charities. And the well-known Giving Pledge, taken by billionaires to commit to giving away half of their wealth either during their lifetime or in their will. Before all of these pledges and new organizations in 1997, Ted Turner independently set an amazing example when he gave $1 billion to the United Nations. Nice job, Ted. The issue of giving to address the needs of others is not trivial, as those needs are dire. From Peter's research, extreme poverty has devastating effects on over 700 million people globally every year. 5.3 million children under the age of 5 die, and more than half of these deaths could have been easily prevented if they would have been fortunate enough to have been born in the United States. In 2020, the world saw global wealth surpass $400 trillion for the first time in history, yet climate extremes and economic slowdowns led 811 million people to go hungry, and the pandemic pushed nearly 100 million people into extreme poverty, creating a historically unprecedented increase in the number of global poor. Peter has famously noted that we have an ethical obligation to use some portion of our wealth and privilege to save lives and reduce the unnecessary suffering associated with extreme poverty, defined as living on less than $1.25 US a day. I feel Peter's key argument in both editions is that our money does more overseas. I personally saw this in my work via the Center for Global Initiatives at the Humera Designated Hospital and the Kabosho Hospital, which deal with TB, pneumonia, immunosuppression, diabetes, accidents and injuries, hypertension, and one season a particularly bad malaria epidemic. We were able to procure the proper medications needed, and at follow-up, we learned that our partners had been able to treat and thus help prevent over 4,100 people from dying of malaria. 28% of those infected were children under the age of 5, an even more vulnerable group. When calculating the cost, it averaged to 73 cents a life. And I have a link for an article that goes into those details that if you're interested, I'd encourage you to take a look at. The amplification of how much further a dollar goes in impoverished countries is the perspective of Peter and Charlie, and they would suggest that would affect our giving decisions. In the preface of his book, Peter writes, "At a minimum, I hope this book will persuade you that there is something deeply askew with our widely accepted views about what it is to live a good life." By clicking a link in my LinkedIn article, you can see Peter Singer's 10th anniversary edition of The Life in Full, and you can get the entire downloadable version of it as an ebook or an audiobook for free right in your inbox. The audiobook is a special treat that I'd encourage you people to take a listen to as well too, because each chapter is narrated by a guest who is a group of really cool people and notables that you'll have a nice surprise for. So check that out. You'll have a nice Easter egg with that. While the rhetoric of Peter's book is on reducing extreme poverty, it seems that the majority of the points in the book are also focused on healthcare. I know that some people that are thankfully not in extreme poverty, nevertheless live in resource-poorer areas and still don't have health care, regardless of affordability. I've lectured on what I call the diseases of poverty, which are ills that are the result of neglect in poverty-stricken communities, and some of my now dated research found that around 30,000 children die each day of preventable diseases caused by poverty. 500,000 children become blind each year from malnutrition, and 1.8 million people die annually from preventable diarrheal diseases. Proven prevention strategies include economic development, ending military conflicts, developing educational models, especially for women, technology leapfrogging and access to information, especially for markets for goods, and fostering sustainable development. Charlie and I are both trained in psychology, and Singer's book gives a number of great examples and scientific studies that come from social psychology and behavioral economics. And Charlie talked about the psychology of giving and some of the reasons people don't give to charity. For me, the aspect of diffusion of responsibility resonated with my working with a friend in Tanzania and in an article that I wrote called Becoming an Accidental Humanitarian that I have a link to. I really was pleasantly surprised about naming opportunities or philanthropic graffiti and how it actually acts to encourage others to likewise donate and serve as a role model rather than presume narcissistic motivations. The point being that we need not worry about a donor's motives, but quite simply to have funds donated to the most impactful organizations. A similar eye-opener was the value brought by having good talent, albeit at a high salary, in the context of ending the overhead myth. And there's a side note, a plug for those interested in working for good causes. If you're searching for a job to do something around that, check out 80,000 Hours. I have a link for that as well. In running a global health nonprofit, I found myself spending a fair amount of time cogitating on the supply side of humanitarian work, philanthropy. I've previously written on the topic an article called Philanthropy for the Rest of Us, easier to write than pronounce, and spoken about the Giving Pledge, which there's some notes in the LinkedIn article. A popular meme in the business literature references Schumpeter's famously attributed philosophy of creative destruction. I suspect this trends more as popular in times of recessions rather than unpleasant and other unpleasant economic upheavals, but I digress. Back on topic, it got me to thinking about what if we applied this concept to philanthropic institutions. I do differ from Peter on one point. I'm a big fanboy of William Easterly and the perspective articulated in his book, The White Man's Burden, which is, Easterly notes that there's an all too common phenomena that well-intended bureaucratic mega-organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and even the United Nations are now so large that much of the funds that they have, they themselves consume. The same may be true for philanthropic foundations, with the added possibility that... Sorry about the interruption. My phone was vibrating, and I was hoping it would not come through. So, as I was saying, the same may be true for philanthropic foundations, with the added possibility that they could eventually run out of funds. But would that be a bad thing? The Gates Foundation has a self-imposed sunsetting over a 50-year spin-down. So thanks, you two. And the Aaron Diamond Foundation is another example of a limited-term foundation. It awarded over $200 million as part of it. Easy for me to say, to spend itself down, which it did between 1987 and 1996. I was at a TED conference a long time ago and first heard Zoe Baird's plans as the then new president of the Markle Foundation to increase the foundation's amount of spending. Indeed, U.S. regulations require a minimum annual distribution of 5% of endowments, but paradoxically, this is treated like it's the maximum. Overhead can be as high as 20%, and I suspect that, too, may wind up being maxed out. In an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, James Panero noted the perspective of Louis Cullman, a fellow with the street cred of having donated hundreds of millions of dollars, which is strikingly similar to Easterly's observation concerning large organizations. Cullman thinks private foundations exist primarily for their own self-perpetuation. Evidence for this may lie in what's happened during the last recession. The Foundation Center surveyed over 1,000 foundations during that time and found an 8.4% drop in giving. Panero notes that this was the worst drop, adjusted for inflation, ever recorded. The logic basic to philanthropy would be that during times of the most need, the most help would be given, not diminished. To Cullman, this is proof positive that some, quote, foundation administrators are more concerned about the size of their nest eggs than the amount of their philanthropic mission, period, or close quote. Open source humanitarian intervention. When I started the Center for Global Initiatives, I didn't want some pretentious name. I wanted something simple and new, something honest and adaptive. I was thinking of studying the problem and fix it, except the acronym really didn't work. It's difficult if you're a government agency or an ideologue, but if you just want to study the problem and fix it, you can. Our center has no bureaucrats. We're all volunteers. All monies go to the work. We run circles around other organizations that are 30, 40, 50 years old and have big buildings, big obligations, big staffs. We don't, and we won't. Sorry, my phone continues to make itself known. They may trade on their youthful dreams, but the truth is they're now part of the establishment, and the establishment works to preserve the status quo. It just does. We work with whoever asks, but only if we can add something of benefit. We do it for free. Our tools, I have links in the article, please check them out, are for those who can use them. Our resources are free. Our time is available. It's our idea of open sourcing everything, always free, all the time, always open. We want to develop new ways to think about this stuff without posturing and pontificating. I plan to run the center for 20 years, and my final task will be to disband it before it becomes another tired old humanitarian organization, spouting outmoded wisdom, wasting resources, and doing more harm than good. By then, I hope to have planted enough apple seeds so that a fleet of folks smarter than me will do what really needs to be done for the next 20 years, and they will then rinse and repeat. Thank you, Professor Schumpeter. Getting to effective altruism. It's not just the Peter and Charlie show when it comes to evaluating the effectiveness of organizations. Their work is a very helpful step saver. From the book, the core features of the framework are intuitive and the focus on problems that are important, tractable, and neglected in the space of poverty and well-being, and all draw upon scientific evidence and research by other charity evaluators such as GiveWell, Founders Pledge, Giving Green, Happier Lives Institute, Charity Navigator, and others to identify cost-effective nonprofits working on impactful interventions to solve these problems. And so just a little bit of a hit parade. They track a range of metrics, including, which I'm a big fan of, outcomes. So they have the core outcomes of nonprofits that aim to change, such as improving health, well-being, improving livelihood and economic opportunity, reducing preventable deaths, and tracking climate change. The target populations of the nonprofit aims to serve such as children, girls, women, people with disabilities, and the general public. The strength of scientific evidence behind the impact potential of a proposed intervention is judged by meta-analyses and research done by other evaluators. The main approaches of the nonprofit takes to achieve these changes, from directly providing services to helping the public and provide sector-scale effectiveness in terms of interventions, to pushing for large-scale systems change through advocacy. Estimates of the nonprofit's impact on core outcomes based on the more rigorous evidence is applicable to its intervention, ranging from more scientific things like randomized controlled trials to quasi-experimental approaches to case studies to peer reviews, etc. Cost-effectiveness analyses of the nonprofit using the most rigorous approaches and impact metrics available. And finally, the nonprofit's commitment to integrity, transparency, learning, and innovation based on its track record, peer reviews, and sector experts. In a parallel vein, I profiled over 45 nonprofits, not foundations though, that I believe to represent what it means to be one of the new humanitarians. And I did a 4-volume book set with that same title. And they apply new approaches not just to measuring impact, but to being actively engaged with those they work with, sometimes at risk to themselves. But that's another story. So now back to what you and I can and should do. Michael Shore, creator of The Good Place, wrote the foreword to the 10th anniversary edition of Peter's book, wherein he referenced Peter's 2006 article in the New York Times Magazine, What Should a Billionaire Give and What Should You?, which simply asks, what should a billionaire give to charity? What should we non-billionaires ostensibly give? And how do we calculate those numbers? And of course, he let us know those amounts are able to be calculated. And he says that it's really, a responsibility we have. There's an amount of money that one needs to live a decent life, he says, to pay for a reasonable amount of rent, clothes, food, and leisure. And if you have more than that amount, he posited, you should give it away because you don't need it. Someone else does. Whew, wow, really? Yeah, really. Complacency. Now, while many of us do benefit from and perhaps even take for granted today's modern comforts, Michael points out that most everyone, regardless of their bank account balance, experiences, quote, economic stress, painful moments, personal and professional disappointment, medical trauma, difficult decisions, trials and tribulations, anxiety, and suffering, which makes it even harder to remember that having $3 to buy a hamburger is a luxury that hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty cannot conceive of, close quote, and even minimalists like a few nice things. How about extreme altruism? It did not take me more than a couple of chapters to start feeling pretty guilty when I was rereading Peter's book, and that I wasn't really doing my fair share. There are some stories and examples of folks who, quote, give away their entire fortunes, tens of millions of dollars, because they concluded that by having a single dollar more than they needed to live was morally problematic, close quote. And there are others, I kid you not, who, quote, voluntarily gave away their kidneys after reading that the chances of dying due to having only one kidney are 1 in 4,000, and thus not giving away their, quote unquote, extra kidney would have meant valuing their own life 4,000 times more than someone else's, close quote. That's way more skin or tissue or more than I'm willing to have in the game, but you get the picture. A modestly demanding view. Peter discusses the obligation philosophers Richard Miller, Garrett Schulte, and Brad Hooker posit may considerably be more demanding than their fair share view. Miller would allow us to purchase a luxury item of attire only occasionally. That stereo that the music lover may buy can be more than minimal, but implies that we are not justified in buying at the top end of the range, even if we can afford it. Schulte allows us to spend a little more significantly on activities that enhance our lives, but spending on trivial items should be, in his view, redirected to helping combat poverty. Hooker's standard imposes on us a significant personal cost against the background of a world in which most affluent people would only give a trivial portion of their income, or none of it at all, to help the poor. An agreement among them and Peter is that we all ought to be giving much more. A realistic standard. In chapter 10, he talks about a realistic standard. Quote, we are used to thinking of morality as black and white. You either do what is right and deserve to be praised, or do what is wrong and deserve to be blamed for failing to do what is right. But moral life is more nuanced than that. We should praise people for doing significantly better than most people in their circumstances, and blame them for doing significantly worse. If you've done more than your fair share, that must at least lessen the blame you deserve. If you have given beyond the usual moral standards, then we should praise you for doing so, rather than blame you for not doing more. In my research for that show, I read a piece in a recent issue of Forbes on America's top givers. It was pretty much what you would expect. Billionaires giving billions. Some notable points popped up, though. Scott Bezos' former wife, was noted to have donated $5.8 billion to over 500 different groups across the country just in 2020. Last year, she continued her giving her fortune away faster than any billionaire ever. And from this Forbes list, 17 of them have signed the Giving Pledge, promising to donate at least half of their fortune to charity over their lifetimes or upon their deaths. But only 2, Chuck Feeney and Soros, by the way, has not signed the Giving Pledge, have hit that mark so far. That caught my eye, so I ran a quick calculation based on the reported numbers. I simply divided the lifetime donation amount of the top 12 listed by their current net worth, which I have that superimposed in the LinkedIn article, so check out the links. So when you do that, take a look at Chuck Feeney's results. The takeaway from this is that he's not a billionaire. He's not even a multimillionaire, but nevertheless he ranked 6th. He has given away 4,000%. 4,000% of his money. The guy and his wife now have $2 million left to live on, while having given away $8 billion. Holy smokes, Chuck. Respect. And hey, Zuck, step it up, bro. P.S. Here's what I found about Chuck in the links in the show notes. I suggest you take a look at them. He's really quite a guy. So that's great. What about the rest of us? I think that's super inspirational, and maybe just we dial it back a bit on the dollars. But in general, the more you earn, the easier it should be to give, not only in terms of dollars, but also as a percentage of income. Charlie noted in our conversation that some ways that we all can give better can be found in the appendix of Peter's book, where the giving scale he lists as a helpful guide. It ranges from 1% for those with adjusted gross incomes between $40,000 and $81,000 to 50% for the top 0.001% of U.S. taxpayers who have incomes more than $53 million a year, which is just sort of staggering to me. And that list is broken out in the show notes if you want to take a look. The idea is that at these levels of giving should not be a significant hardship on anyone. Although, admittedly, lower income levels, this would depend on your individual circumstances, how many kids, etc., indebtedness, whatnot. So be sure to look at the show note link of the Life You Can Save pledge, where you can insert your income and see whether the proper amount would be a fit for you, and then you can commit to the pledge as well there if you would like. #hypocrite. I do have to say that after reading this updated edition of his book, I was shocked by the figures of poverty's destruction, persuaded by ethical arguments, and impressed with what others have chosen to do. And I thought I was doing a good job. But now, I just feel like a hypocrite. The book's foreword spoke to me in that, quote, "Because even though you already do a great deal to help other people in need, you also owe a lot you also own a large flat-screen TV and a soft, comfy bathrobe and an autographed baseball bat signed by your favorite player that costs $300, none of which technically you need. And then you may feel anger because you think of yourself as someone who tries to do the right thing whenever you can, and you like your comfy robe. It's comfy, damn it. And who is this guy telling you that you shouldn't buy that robe anyway? And also, he's talking about giving away your kidneys. And how is that any kind of reasonable standard? But this is exactly the point, because more importantly than what you feel is what you read when you read this book, that you won't feel complacency. You will not feel like other people don't matter. You will not blithely scroll past reports of disasters, whether abroad or close to home, without considering, even for just a moment, the impacted lives of those affected." Close quote. And as a final kindness to its readers, the author does recognize that we may, quote, "feel shame for not being one of those people, but you do not have to give away your kidney or bankrupt yourself to improve the lives of the extremely poor, to abide by the tenets of this book. You merely have to ask yourself a few questions. What am I doing as a human being on earth to help the less fortunate? Can I perhaps do a little bit more? And if so, how?" Close quote. I love that. No judging here. Well, maybe just a little. Here are some of the frank points that the book makes and also calls BS on. Myth number 1, donating to help people in my own community is best. Myth number 2, you have to be brave to save lives. Myth number 3, hard work determines one's economic success. Myth number 4, a strong sense of compassion should determine where we donate. Myth number 5, I am not materialistic. Myth number 6, COVID will be among the deadliest killers in Africa. Myth number 7, aiming to be perfect is only for perfectionists. Myth number 8, philanthropy is only a drop in the bucket. And myth number 9, the only way to do good is to give to our recommended nonprofits. So take a look at how he debunks each one of those myths, and I've got them linked in the notes. So, too long, did not read Peter's perspective in 6 bullet points, and I added one more. People are needlessly dying. Our Western money goes much further outside of the West, and he calls it amplification. We have a moral responsibility to help those in need, and most of us want to do what is right. Most of us can do more than we are currently doing. We all should give proportionately to what is appropriate for our income and our situation. And simple, period, full stop. And my respectful addition by Joe Heller. My respectful addition is B. Joe Heller. There's a link in the notes for that, and you can take a look and see what I mean. Role modeling. I know Charlie Bresler walks the talk. Peter donated all of his $1 million Brueggen Prize money. And so in the spirit of role modeling and being transparent as to giving and not peacocking, I have a link to what I personally have done. I'm trying to put my money where my mouth and my heart is. And you can be the judge. Take a look at that link if you're interested. The new status flex. Maybe we could all work to create a new norm of social signaling based on how much we help others via our time, talent, and/or treasure. Maybe posting on donating your Rolex rather than buying one, or pulling in the used car lot with your Lambo and gifting the title to a nonprofit. Imagine the boost you'd get to your social cred on Insta, or maybe even Tinder. I don't think there is value in dickering as to my cause is better than your cause. I'm just happy for folks to get involved in making donations. It's okay with me for you to keep your kidneys, but my bias and recommendation is to consider your first dollars to be earmarked for charitable organizations that demonstrate their effectiveness and ROI. There are plenty, and then see how you can grow from there. #BetterWorld. Thanks for listening.